So let's talk Brazil. It's massive. Takes up half the continent in South America.
Right, and unique too, being Portuguese-speaking in a largely Spanish-speaking region.
Totally. And it just feels so alive,
Yeah,
Big cities, the deep Amazon, and its history, wow, it's just as big and complicated.
absolutely. And that's our focus for this deep dive. We've got the source, a brief history of Brazil, and we're going to unpack it.
Okay, sounds good. So what's the plan? What are we looking for here?
Well, the idea is to pull out the really key moments, the turning points, maybe some surprising facts, to get a solid handle on how Brazil got to where it is now. Give you a comprehensive but still digestible picture.
Got it. A deep dive into the key insights. Okay, let's start way back. Pre-colonial Brazil.
Right. Because before the Portuguese showed up in 1500, this place was definitely not empty.
Yeah, the source mentioned something like 3 million indigenous people.
Estimated, yeah. A whole mosaic of different ethnic groups, many linked by the Tupi-Guarani language family. They had complex societies, deep connections to the land.
Which must have been such a contrast to the Europeans when they arrived.
Totally different perspective. The Europeans were initially focused on, well, exploration, trade, finding things they could profit from. Sugarcane planting became big early on.
So land and labor were key right from the start.
Exactly. That drove everything. And by 1549, Portugal had formally set up its colonial administration.
And the way the Europeans saw Brazil, it sounds like they just saw dollar signs or maybe gold signs. Limitless potential riches.
Pretty much. Gold, ores, resources. A treasure chest. And this mindset, the source calls it the Great Era of Black Myth. It fueled this really exploitative approach.
Towards everything.
Towards everything. The land, the environment, the indigenous people themselves, the plants, the animals. It was all seen through this lens of extraction.
Wow. That really sets a tone, doesn't it?
It profoundly shaped Brazil's development, yeah. And you can still see echoes of that mindset today in debates about resource management.
The source mentions a specific group, the Tupinamba. Encountered them early on along the coast.
That's right, southeastern coast. They were significant. Their language was apparently so common, it almost functioned as the language of Brazil for trade and communication between different groups.
That shows how complex things already were before the Portuguese even arrived.
Absolutely. And there's this fascinating detail about a Tupinamba ceremony involving captured Portuguese. Apparently, this practice offended other indigenous groups, like the Timinas.
Offended them enough to side with the Portuguese?
Exactly. The Timinas formed alliances with the Portuguese against the Tupinamba because of this.
That's a twist. It really drives home that the indigenous population wasn't monolithic at all.
Not even close. Different customs, different beliefs, and the Portuguese arrival just added another layer of complexity to those existing relationships.
Okay, stepping back for a second. Geographically, Brazil is just enormous. Fifth largest country.
Yep. Borders almost every other country in South America. Huge exporter to fruits, fish, processed foods, you name it.
And the tourism. Iguazu Falls, the Amazon, Rio's beaches, iconic places.
Definitely. And more recently, Brazil's really stepped onto the world stage as a major player. The source mentions former President Lula da Silva's global standing.
Which makes you wonder, with the recent political shifts, how that global role might change going forward.
That's a key question, for sure.
Okay, let's jump to 1500. Pedro Alvarez Cabral arrives. Porto Seguro. This kicks off the colonial period, right? Lasts over 300 years.
1500 to 1822, yeah. And one of the first big hurdles for the Portuguese was this issue of land ownership.
How so?
Well, the indigenous people weren't Portuguese subjects, so technically they owned the land. This made it difficult for the Portuguese crown to just grant land for, say, sugar plantations, which they really wanted to do.
Oh, okay. And then the Jesuit priests arrived. They were trying to convert and educate the indigenous people.
That was their mission, yes, saving souls. But their relationship with the Portuguese settlers was complicated.
Because the settlers just saw the natives as labor?
Largely, yeah. There was this fundamental clash. Settlers wanting bodies for work, Jesuits wanting souls for God. It created a lot of tension and had a huge impact on the indigenous communities.
It's also kind of wild how the first Portuguese viewed the land itself. The source says they found it savage, poor in useful products.
Yeah, descriptions mention just a few palms, some familiar plants, but mostly dense, thorny shrubs they didn't see much use for. Not exactly the paradise they might have expected.
Maybe that spurred them on to change it, to impose their own agriculture.
Very likely. That initial negative view probably reinforced their desire to reshape the land to fit their own needs, regardless of what was already there.
And we shouldn't forget the religious angle either. The source mentions the ongoing crusade against Moors and Protestants as a motivation.
Absolutely crucial context. This wasn't just about economics. It was deeply tied into the religious conflicts and fervor of that era in Europe. It colored their interactions significantly.
The source briefly compares the Portuguese approach to the Spanish in places like Montevideo or Buenos Aires. Different focus.
Yeah, points out that the Spanish, in some areas at least, were really focused on things like silver mining, whereas the Portuguese early on were pushing sugar. Shows the different strategies the European powers had.
So in those first 30 years or so after Cabral, what was the impact on the indigenous people? Was the territory just seen as a commodity?
Pretty much. For almost 3 decades, it was viewed primarily as something to be exploited for profit, with very little regard for the people already living there or the long-term consequences.
Even without strong official administration at first, people were still going there. Settlers, adventurers.
Oh, yeah. Lots of private visits, people looking to make a quick fortune from Brazil wood or other resources. It was a bit of a free-for-all in some ways, focused on short-term gain.
Imagine being one of those first settlers. The source describes their astonishment turning to terror. The wilderness, the indigenous people.
It must have been overwhelming. Dense forests, rivers everywhere, and then hearing the sounds, cries, songs, and warlike chants. A real clash of worlds. That fear definitely shaped those early, often violent encounters.
Right. Okay, let's shift focus a bit. Sugar. The source calls it the richest harvest. Introduced around 1530.
Yeah, not long after the first permanent settlement. And the demand in Europe was just exploding.
So sugar plantations became the economic engine.
Absolutely. The whole early colonial economy revolved around it. Growing the cane, processing it, shipping it. An entire industry built to satisfy Europe's sweet tooth. It was so successful, even Spain started copying it in their colonies.
But the system for granting land, these donatory captaincies, it sounds flawed. The land went back to the crown if the grantee died.
Yeah, that was a major drawback. It created a lot of instability. Why invest long-term if you might lose the land? It probably encouraged more short-term exploitative thinking and led to bankruptcies.
Now, much of Brazil has that tropical climate, right? Including São Paulo. Good for agriculture.
Definitely. And even though São Paulo wasn't the main sugar region initially, the source notes they were using indigenous and then African slave labor there quite early on.
So slavery was embedded early, even before the big coffee boom later.
Exactly. It shows how fundamental forced labor was to the colonial economy across different regions, even before São Paulo's main export really took off.
Because that came later, right? Late 19th century, with coffee.
That's when São Paulo really boomed economically. Coffee cultivation exploded, especially as railroads opened up the interior.
And that drove up demand for slaves.
Massively. Second half of the 19th century, the demand for enslaved people in São Paulo surged. By 1872, a huge portion of Brazil's enslaved population was concentrated right there.
It's chilling how these commodity cycles are directly linked to the horrors of slavery.
Inextricably linked, different crops, different regions, but the reliance on enslaved labor was a tragic constant for centuries.
Okay, let's jump much closer to the present. Since the 1990s, Brazil's seen some pretty impressive economic growth, yeah. Commodities, internal growth.
It has, definitely. But the source also flags ongoing challenges. Things like managing the wealth from natural resources effectively, improving education. These are still big hurdles.
Right, and things like the BRICS alliance are part of trying to tackle that, to secure its place globally.
Precisely. It's about leveraging its economic strengths and finding ways to ensure that growth is sustainable and benefits more people.
Though, despite that growth spurt earlier, the source mentioned social unrest more recently. So growth didn't solve everything.
That's a critical point. Economic expansion doesn't automatically equal social harmony or stability. Tackling inequality remains a huge ongoing task for Brazil.
But Brazil does have incredible assets. The source mentions rich lands, biodiversity, cultural diversity, potential sources of prosperity.
Huge potential. The Amazon alone, covering 60% of the country, is immense. Managing it sustainably is key, not just for the environment, but for the economy and for poverty reduction, too.
Plus, it's a major player in resources globally. Iron ore, gold.
Second largest gold producer, major iron ore supplier, significant oil and gas, huge agricultural exporter. These resources have always been central to its economy.
Let's talk about that gold. Late 17th century, a gold rush kicks off. Rio das Velhas area.
Yeah, discovery of gold, gems, platinum, diamonds down there. It caused a huge influx of people and wealth into that region.
But the boom was short-lived. Only about 20 years.
The main gold boom, yeah, relatively short. Diamond mines were found later, but apparently not as rich as India's. And diamond mining was super strictly regulated.
How strict?
Very. Heavy penalties for breaking the rules. The source mentions slaves being priced in gold, and all the gold had to be sold directly to the crown's agents. They wanted maximum control over that wealth.
There's a story about Portuguese traders finding gold in the Sierra de Cadasaltas in 1697, sparking another wave.
Right, captures that gold fever excitement, people rushing in, hoping to strike it rich.
But it wasn't all smooth sailing. Conflicts with indigenous groups like the Aparatos, attacking settlements.
Definitely. While some indigenous groups might have traded, others fought back hard against the miners encroaching on their lands. It was often violent.
So the gold rush further disrupted indigenous life.
Massively. More displacement, more conflict. It was another wave of disruption.
And this gold discovery even sparked debates back in Portugal about the royal family maybe moving to Brazil. And who actually owned these minerals?
Yeah, it raised really fundamental questions about sovereignty, control over this newfound wealth, and the whole relationship between the colony and the crown. Big political implications.
Okay, shifting gears again, but sticking with movement of people. Contemporary migration, mostly from nearby countries.
That's what the source indicates for recent trends. People coming from Argentina, Bolivia, Paraguay, often drawn by family ties, networks, looking for low-skilled work, mainly in the South.
And this is causing discussion, right? About migrants' well-being, impact on communities.
For sure. It's changing the social landscape in those areas, raising questions about integration, support services, and new people are facilitating this migration, changing the dynamics, too.
Looking back at economic shifts again, the 1930s and 40s sound crucial, moving from agriculture toward industry.
A major transition, yeah. Influenced by the Great Depression globally and the rise of the auto industry, though Brazil was a bit slower to motorize initially compared to world trends.
And this involved overthrowing the coffee oligarchs in 1930 and bringing in protectionist policies.
Exactly, a real change in direction, trying to build up domestic industry.
Then we get the Vargas regime, the plan de Metas for development, but then more political shifts. Goulart ousted in '64 by the military.
Right. And the source mentions a period of neo-dependence, meaning still economically reliant on outside powers despite being independent before democracy started being rebuilt in the 90s.
It's a complex path, lots of twists and turns.
Definitely. A constant struggle for stable development and political footing.
Okay, independence. How did that come about? Brazil became part of the United Kingdom of Portugal, Brazil, and Algarve in 1815.
Yes, an elevation in status. But then a liberal revolution happened in Portugal itself in 1820, creating a lot of instability there.
And Dom Pedro, I saw his chance.
He did. Son of the Portuguese King John VI, he was in Brazil. He took advantage of the chaos in Portugal and the fear here of being put back under strict colonial rule. Declared independence September 7th, 1822. Established a monarchy.
And this monarchy, the source calls it both absolute in crown power, but constitutional, by bringing the elite on board.
Yeah, an interesting balancing act. Trying to centralize power, but also needing the support of the powerful landowners and elites. And lower middle-class movements started getting involved politically, too.
But it didn't have widespread popular support initially. Lots of conflict between elites.
Right. Lack of popular legitimacy was an issue, and the elites themselves were divided between more progressive and conservative factions. Made for a shaky start.
But under Dom Pedro II, it became more genuinely constitutional, led to more stability.
That's the argument. More popular legitimacy, and eventually a less violent end to the monarchy compared to what happened in some neighboring republics.
The source also mentions historical writing from the 16th century, chronicles, poems, important for understanding early Brazil.
Incredibly important. These early accounts, despite their biases, give us insights into how Europeans first saw Brazil, the land, the people, the potential. There was a real need for information back in Europe.
And things shifted again after Napoleon. The monarchy restored in Portugal in 1814, but Brazil reacted differently than Lisbon.
Yeah, less enthusiasm for the restored monarchy in Brazil shows a growing sense of separate identity, less willingness to just follow Lisbon's lead.
Events in Goiás in 1821 are mentioned as an early sign.
An early tremor of the independence earthquake, yeah. Then Pedro comes back to Rio. Things move quickly, and boom, independence declared in 1822.
And they quickly set up defenses, a navy to meet the Portuguese force and to stop them. Pedro becomes emperor.
All part of consolidating that independence, establishing the institutions, the symbols of a new nation, even early efforts at setting up an education system.
So independence declared, empire established. But the source says things are still pretty chaotic. Big country, diverse population.
Exactly. Declaring independence is one thing, actually governing that vast territory is another. They largely relied on co-opting the existing power structures left over from the Portuguese court.
Including that idea of the ruler as a good father and keeping censorship.
Pretty much. Continuity in some ways. Using familiar authoritarian structures to maintain order.
Education was a focus early on, though. Decrees in 1824.
Yeah, setting up a system with central directives but provincial implementation. Controlling higher education was seen as strategically key.
But Dom Pedro, I wasn't afraid to assert power. Dissolved the assembly in 1823, pushed through his own constitution.
Definitely showed his autocratic side. That constitution had a big impact, even if not everyone loved it. And there were always liberal groups pushing back against his policies.
Still, it sounds like things eventually settled down somewhat. Reforms got approved, magistrates made adjustments.
Just a certain pragmatism, yeah. A capacity to adapt and compromise even amidst disagreements.
And economically during the empire. Still, lots of resource exploitation, gold, diamonds. Founding of São Paulo and Rio helped expand the market.
For sure. Those early cities were crucial hubs. And remember that union of Portugal and Spain in 1580? Spanish tried to invade Brazil, which actually led the Portuguese to strengthen coastal defenses and push settlement inland.
Right, and that huge moment when the Portuguese court fled Napoleon and moved to Brazil in 1808.
Game changer. Elevated Brazil's status immensely. And when the court went back to Lisbon, Dom Pedro first stayed, which led directly to independence.
The source argues the monarchy, post-independence, became quite liberal and helped integrate the country.
It's a perspective, yeah. Suggesting it played a constructive role in forging a unified nation out of diverse regions.
And its end was tied to broader trends. Rise of constitutionalism, revolutions elsewhere in the Portuguese world.
Seems so. Plus, internally, Brazil was modernizing, the coffee elites were getting richer and more powerful, the monarchy started to look outdated.
Dom Pedro II didn't fight his overthrow. And the source says the Republicans kind of built on the monarchy's foundations.
Yeah, apparently he accepted it quite passively. And it's often the case, isn't it? New regimes often benefit from structures or developments created by the ones they replace.
Okay, on to the Republic era. Kicks off with a military coup, November 15th, 1889, overthrows Dom Pedro II.
Right. After a long reign where major things happened, like abolishing slavery, Marshal Deodoro da Fonseca led the coup.
And the imperial family was exiled, though allowed back later.
Ordered out initially, yes. Prohibition lifted in 1920. The narrative was all about creating a modern, civilized republic.
But the early republic sounds messy, politically unstable, right up to the Vargas era. Weak presidents, conflict, eruption.
Very unstable. The source mentions this thing called the polia. Basically, networks of local politicians, presidents relied on to get anything done, trading favors, lots of corruption built in.
Washington Luiz, the last president ousted in 1930. Growing influence of São Paulo politics, too.
Yeah, São Paulo's economic power was translating into political clout, creating tensions with other regions like Minas Gerais.
Despite the instability, the economy grew massively over the 20th century, 7% average.
Remarkable growth, yeah, fueled by those natural resources. Foreign investment after WWII helped market reforms later on, too.
But bumps in the road, like the early 90s, macroeconomic problems, industrial policy mistakes.
Definitely setbacks. But Brazil eventually came out stronger, more stable, joined BRICS, got investment-grade status, opportunities opened up.
Though the economy is described as maybe less internationalized than some, manufacturing struggling a bit globally.
Yeah, relatively self-sufficient in some ways, but maybe not fully plugged into global supply chains. Policymakers often seem caught between nationalist protection and neoliberal opening, a tricky balance.
Then comes the Vargas era, a real turning point. 1934 Constitution, elected president. Vargas gets elected by assembly.
Right. It was a period of modernization, social and economic reforms, some stability. But under Vargas's increasingly authoritarian hand.
What kinds of reforms?
Social reforms, expanding government agencies, labor, commerce, transport, etc. More government control over business.
Leading to the Estado Novo, where he became a dictator.
Essentially, yeah. Dictator for about 15 years until he was forced out in 45 under pretty demoralizing circumstances.
His policies were far-reaching. Nationalizing banks, higher tariffs, labor laws, minimum wage, but also removing votes for illiterates.
A real mix. Big state intervention trying to modernize and control the economy and society. Some progressive elements, some deeply authoritarian ones.
And his rise came out of that 1930 election mess. The split between São Paulo and Minas Gerais, the Liberal Alliance.
That political maneuvering was key. He rode a wave of discontent.
The 1930s Constituent Assembly sounds like it was pretty heated, plus the Great Depression hitting industry hard.
A tough time. Vargas used the crisis, suspended the Constitution, dismissed Congress, ruled by decree until 45.
Businesses liked him at first, but then faced economic problems. Opposition grew.
Initially, yes, hoping for stability. But economic downturns and his authoritarianism eventually eroded that support.
Now, interestingly, the source says the military regime that came after Vargas actually brought in social reforms, healthcare, education.
It's complex, isn't it? Even authoritarian regimes can implement social programs. The military regime started a big education reform in '68, expanding access, raising teacher pay, building schools, lots more colleges and universities.
And a health and social services ministry in '67. Expanding medical services.
Yes, significant expansion at all levels. So improvements in social infrastructure, but happening under a dictatorship that severely restricted freedoms.
Speaking of the military, the source traces their intervention way back to 1889, ending the empire. Establishing a shaky republic, Fonseca's regime was quasi-dictatorial.
Right. There's a long history of the military stepping into politics in Brazil. It set a precedent.
Which leads to the 1964 coup. President Quadros resigned, VP Goulart took over, tensions were high, U.S. worried about Soviet influence.
A volatile situation. The military moved in, took key cities, Goulart fled, and a coup government took power with U.S. backing.
And this ushered in the long military dictatorship, 1964 to 1985. The source is clear about the human rights abuses.
Very clear. Torture, imprisonment, persecution, killings, often covered up. It mentions torture as part of an extermination policy with discriminatory aspects.
And accountability was limited afterwards by amnesty laws.
Yes, those laws made it difficult to prosecute state agents for abuses committed during the dictatorship. A very painful legacy.
The source also brings up indigenous resistance during earlier periods, like the rubber boom around 1911. Conflicts with settlers.
Yeah, tribes like the Yao, Munduruku, Guajara fighting back against encroachment, getting caught up in the often illicit rubber trade, shows that resistance has been a constant theme.
Okay, so finally, the return to democracy. The 1988 Constitution, jubilation, civil liberties restored.
A huge moment, yes. End of 21 years of military rule. But the source cautions that deep social and economic problems remained unaddressed.
And citizens started pushing for more direct democracy, power of the people.
Yes, lots of initiatives emerged, people wanting more say in decisions. But results were mixed, especially early on. Some governments still acted autocratically despite the new rights.
But people kept pushing, moving from just pointing out problems to demanding solutions.
Exactly, leading to some real successes, particularly at the local level.
The '88 Constitution itself was shaped by that experience of repression, right? Aiming for predictable laws.
Very much so, a reaction against the arbitrary power of the dictatorship. And it impacted not just state structure, but also civil law.
Politically, after the military left, the MDB party and the PT gained strength, challenging the old local bosses, the colonels.
Yeah, new political forces emerged. NGOs and social movements also became much more active in denouncing abuses and pushing for change.
But things like participatory budgeting faced pushback later, especially after the 2013 protests.
Seems so. Resistance from the right. And the return to democracy didn't magically solve Brazil's internal divisions, the size, regional inequality, poverty, violence, the hyper-centralized politics.
So democracy restored, but the underlying challenges were still massive.
Absolutely. Formal democracy was just the start of a very long process.
Which brings us to contemporary Brazil, an emerging country trying to overcome poverty and inequality, facing tough times, but with potential.
That's the picture. Expected to play a bigger role globally, but still grappling with major domestic issues. Brazil's had impressive growth, uninterrupted democracy since the 90s, better access to basic services. But poor rankings in things like banking efficiency, governance compared to other BRICS cities, basic services still not universal, huge income concentration, millions facing food insecurity, a real mix.
The source mentions earlier periods, like Kubitschek's presidency, 1956-61, focus on balanced industrial agricultural growth, import substitution, signing peace pacts.
Yeah, part of that mid-century push for modernization and establishing Brazil's international presence.
Then the Brazilian miracle in the early 70s, fast growth, but also inflation, debt, inequality.
Exactly. Rapid expansion, but with significant downsides and imbalances that created later problems.
There's also mention of this cultural yearning for a renaissance, contrasted with ongoing problems like corruption, social issues,
Yeah, this aspiration for cultural greatness versus the harsh realities on the ground, a persistent tension.
and the current political scene, often described as polarized, media playing a big role. Bolsonaro mentioned as part of a global far-right trend.
Seems to reflect wider global patterns, yeah. Increased polarization, challenges to establish norms, media influence. Complex times politically.
Brazil's always wanted a big global role, hasn't it? Active in the UN, G20, BRICS,
Mm-hmm.
but maybe modest hard power.
Right. Long-standing ambitions, active diplomacy, but translating that into concrete global influence is tough. The source even notes a lack of a major foreign language summary of Brazil for the world.
The first real party-based election was 1930. Those formative years shaped a lot, and U.S. perceptions of Brazil have evolved.
Key moments in setting the political trajectory, and the U.S.-Brazil relationship is always a factor.
Brazil's pushed regional projects in South America, tried to amplify its voice post-2003, but then hit economic headwinds, domestic scandals, UNASUR, Mercosur, efforts to gain influence.
Yeah, a pattern of trying to build regional alliances and exert influence, but facing internal and external obstacles.
Culturally, it's becoming a bigger player. Filmmaking destination, exporting music, dance, Brazilian communities abroad, Brazuca literature.
Definitely growing cultural influence and presence globally. The diaspora is contributing to that too.
So, summing up the contemporary situation, huge country, population concentrated, growing middle class, but extreme inequality persists. Poverty, violence, corruption, still major issues. Politics hyper-centralized.
That captures a lot of it. Deep-rooted problems alongside progress. And that centralized power structure limits local accountability. Brazilian foreign policy also tends to avoid formal alliances, preferring developing world partnerships.
And the environment. Incredibly rich, but facing degradation from past growth models. Ongoing exploitation, weak enforcement, major commodity exporter historically.
A critical issue. Balancing development with environmental protection is a massive challenge, especially with global pressures on poverty making it harder.
Still one of the most unequal nations, despite some improvement. Limited social mobility historically, better education access now, but quality varies hugely. Endemic corruption hurting investment, infrastructure.
All major factors. Corruption has incredibly deep roots. Inequality is stark. Education gains are real, but uneven.
So Brazil's at a crossroads. Technocratic politics, maybe less coherent than other BRICS, contradictions in its economic model, UN ambitions, trade stance, allegations of being faux, welfare state slowing.
Lots of tensions and contradictions, challenges to political representation, development hurdles in a fragmented world. Its global economic footprint is smaller than its potential might suggest. Manufacturing facing stiff competition.
But on the positive side, big advances in social indicators over the last decade or so. Social safety net, child mortality down, education, health access up, SUS, health system created.
Absolutely crucial improvements. Significant government investment in social programs led to real gains in quality of life indicators for many. Fertility rates dropped, child mortality plummeted, education spending rose.
And just to round off the history,
Hmm.
post-WWII saw adaptations, democracy restored eventually, Vargas Era ended, then the '64 military coup imposing a pro-U.S. market approach.
Right. Bring us back through those major 20th century shifts that shaped the Brazil we see today.
Wow, okay. That was, a really deep dive. Brazil's history is just incredibly layered, isn't it? From those pre-colonial societies right up to today's complexities. This source, A Brief History of Brazil, really packed a punch.
It really did. And,
Well-
one thing that really stands out is that constant tension, that push and pull between Brazil's incredible natural wealth and the struggle to make that translate into, equitable and sustainable development for everyone.
Yeah, and those cycles you mentioned, the booms and busts of sugar, gold, coffee, industry, each one leaving such a distinct mark, shaping the economy, society, even the geography.
And the political journey, too. Monarchy, republic, dictatorship, back to democracy. It wasn't a straight line, was it? Shaped by so many internal pressures and external forces.
Gives you a real sense of the forces at play. So this overview, it feels like a really solid foundation for understanding where Brazil is now and maybe where it's headed.
I think so. It provides that crucial context for the opportunities and, let's be honest, the significant challenges it faces.
So thinking about all the resources, the history, the complexities, here's something for you, our listener, to mull over. What single factor do you think will be most decisive for Brazil's global role in the next few decades? Is it going to be nailing the economic policy, finally tackling that deep social inequality, getting a handle on environmental sustainability, or maybe achieving lasting political stability.
It's a tough one, isn't it? So many interconnected factors.
Definitely something to think about as Brazil keeps writing its next chapter.